Following Christ, chapter 16, the urgency of today. Greetings, I'm JC Pilcher, and this is JCPC Apologetics. Well, hello guys, and welcome to another episode in our review of Charles Spurgeon's work, Following Christ. I just apologize for the hat. This was a work day. I didn't have the opportunity to comb my head because I had hat hair, and I was like, I need to shoot this now while it's fresh in my brain. So what do? I just switch hats from my delivery cap to my whatever this is on my head. Just ignore the hat, but acknowledge the cool shirt. What's Wrong with You People R.C. Sproul shirt, which I should be wearing like every time I do a bad arguments video, but quite frankly, I don't want to. But with that said, let's dive into this chapter. Today, this chapter is on, it's a very unique chapter. Unique in the sense of, it wasn't that exciting to me. I'm going to be honest. Of the chapters that I've read up to this point, this was probably my least favorite. Mainly because, writing has, shall we say, evolved over the years. Now editing's a lot easier. Now doing a lot of the work that we do is a lot easier. And I feel like, nowadays we tend to follow a blueprint and outline very, to the letter, and everything seems to be flowing to the whole overall point of the book that we write. I've noticed some of these older authors tend to have sometimes what I would call a shotgun approach to things, where it's like, okay, generally everything in the book kind of links up to the main idea of the book, but sometimes there doesn't actually seem to be like a flow to it. It's just kind of a shotgun blast of ideas. And this chapter felt kind of like a shotgun blast. It was sort of still in line with much of what we've covered already, that is following Christ. I mean, what's the primary thing I've been talking about in almost every chapter? That it's about following Christ in the sense of service to Christ. Today, it's still in that vein. It's still predominantly about sharing your faith. But I guess really the only change of emphasis in this chapter is that he is expressing urgency. Guys, we need to hurry up and do this. We don't need to be hiding our light under a bushel. We don't need to be silent. Preach what you have, which is kind of a good message. But after all, I think that was what he talked about in the last chapter was you don't have to know it all. Just preach what you do know. But that kind of is the same emphasis that we see in this chapter. The only difference is now he's trying to really amping up the encouragement, hurry up. Another emphasis that he has in this chapter is not being silent. Obviously, that kind of goes along with what I just said. But don't be silent in the sense of, he said, basically, he used the example of the lepers in the book of, I think it was 1st or 2nd Kings. I'll have to look that up. Maybe I'll tag it on here or someone will correct me because I've been corrected a few times, and it's nice to have followers who will actually, correct me when I need it. So that, so you can put me up there if I'm correct, or incorrect. But the story of the lepers who are, they're at the city of Jerusalem when it's being besieged, and they come to the conclusion, hey, we're lepers. We're going to die. If we just stay here in Jerusalem, we're going to die. If we go out to the Assyrians, I believe it who were attacking them, they might spare us and they might kill us. So we're going to die if we stay here. We might die if we go out there, but we might have a chance if we go out there. And so they go out to see the Assyrians, and they have been dispersed. God has defeated them without the help of the Israelites. And what do? They immediately go and start grabbing spoils. And then one of them says, hey, guys, what we're doing is not good. If we do this, we're going to be guilty of the blood of the people in the city. We need to actually, go in there and tell people what's happened. He uses this as a example of, believers who, he says, just as these guys said, we would be guilty if we said nothing. He says, the same is true for you. If you don't actually share what you claim to believe, you're guilty of, the blood of every person that you have had contact with and has not heard the gospel. He's, says as we as believers ought to be able to bleed the gospel everywhere we go. That's what we ought to be known for. And then he uses a lot of examples of people that he's met and people that he knows who, they're known for anything and everything but the faith that they claim to profess. And that's kind of a convicting thing. That's something that we ought to really stop and think about. Are we guilty of that? Are we guilty of not actually sharing our faith like we ought? That's one of the main reasons why in this on this channel, I make a point every time I do an episode to mention the first video that I put on this channel. It's called What is the Gospel? And by the way, if you have not seen that video, I recommend that you click on it because the gospel comes first and foremost. I don't want to be one of those ministries that so emphasize the gospel that they don't emphasize, actually discipling people. But I also don't want to be one of those channels that also so emphasizes discipleship that they don't actually preach the gospel. And I've seen both of those extremes. So if you're on this channel and you've never heard the gospel, I recommend that you click on that video. I'm going to leave it linked after this one's over and down in the description as well. But not only that, now that I've got my plug in, let's continue on. He said, we need to make sure that we are free of the blood guilt of the people that we know. We need to make sure that they hear the gospel from us. But not only that, he said, he convicts a lot of people by saying, many people go around as if they are ashamed of the gospel that they claim to believe. And that was a very interesting thing for me when I heard that, because as I've mentioned in other videos that we've done in this series, it's very interesting to see how so many of the things that was being dealt with in Spurgeon's day, guess what? They're the exact same situation that we have today. Many people who call themselves Christians, and nowadays, most of what is called Big Eva, they're embarrassed to be Christians. They're embarrassed of what, Christianity teaches. They're embarrassed to claim the name of Christ. And in the case of Big Eva, nowadays, they're trying to actually take the things that have, that scriptures teaches it and say that that's whiteness and that we should reject it and therefore turn to what they are now pushing as social justice, which, is far worse than actually being ashamed of the gospel. It's now saying, okay, we've got to hate the gospel and preach another gospel. But of course, we're not dealing with fake Christians. We want to deal with the actual church here. Many people who call themselves Christians are ashamed of the gospel. Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of God unto salvation. We ought not to be ashamed either. When we preach the gospel, we don't have to apologize for what we believe. But sadly, when you get people to preach the gospel anymore, very often it's kind of couched in behind a million apologies and qualifiers. And by the end of it, you're not sure that you've actually heard the gospel. You just heard a big apology for whatever this guy who's talking to you has believed. There are three more things that I wanted to mention about this chapter. Just quick thoughts that he mentioned that I found very interesting and worth taking some time to consider. The first one, he talks about many of us stay silent from a sense of false humility. That is, many of the younger believers have a hard time speaking. He emphasizes in this chapter also, we need to be willing to speak about the good things of God to fellow believers. We need it. I mentioned it in many of my videos. Believers need the gospel as much as unbelievers. We need to hear that gospel and be reminded of every day. And he said, very often we believers will come together and we'll meet and we won't talk about the things of God. We'll talk about the weather. We'll talk about sports. We'll talk about anything and everything, but we won't talk about the gospel, the thing that should be that one thing that ties us all together, keeps us together. And he says, and very often that comes because the younger Christian is thinking, oh, I can't talk to him about the gospel because, or about anything related to Jesus because he knows so much more than me. What have I got to say that he hasn't already heard? First of all, rehashing things is good. It's good for our memory. One thing I've learned is that the more I learn, the more I forget. And sometimes I get the joy of learning the same thing 3 different times, before it actually sticks in my brain. And even after it's stuck in my brain for a while, sometimes I'll lose it again and have to be reminded a fourth. So it's always good to be rehashing the same old truths. They may seem basic and seem like something that the older believers don't need to hear anymore, but the fact is, they need to be reminded of it too. So Spurgeon is encouraging, even if you have very little, speak the truth that you have, be an encouragement to your fellow believers, and preach the gospel to the unbelievers. And he says that there's also an issue with older believers who their mind's not as sharp as they used to be. They haven't, maybe they don't have the talent they think that the younger people do. And so they have a tendency to stay quiet, not speaking to the younger people because they have their own feeling of inferiority. Guys, as believers, we ought to bleed the gospel. When we speak the gospel, the scriptures, they ought to tie into what we have, into our conversations. Somehow or another, we need to be actually, sometimes you meet people who claim that they are Christians. And actually, let me go off on a tangent and talk about a story. There was one time when I was working in my first job. I was like 16, and I was working with this one gal, and she was a pagan. She just lived her life like a pagan, like everyone else. Very foul-mouthed, very wicked and vile lifestyle. And one day she was talking about some movie that came out that she didn't like. And she says, that was offensive to me as a Christian. And I was like, Christian? You Christian? That it really caught me off guard. And no, that was what was going through my head. What I did on the outside was probably just sit there with my mouth just kind of hung open like, what? Many people who claim to be Christians, and some who genuinely are, you can, be around them for a long time and never know that they're actually believers because they never say anything. And that's a problem. The second thing that I'd like to mention is that Charles Spurgeon mentioned that some people are silent about what they believe. They're silent about the gospel because they're afraid of how a person might receive it. They're worried that the person will not be happy about it. And he reminds us that, again, the increase is something that comes from God. Our job is just to speak it. We don't know how they're going to receive it. Yes. Does it make the thing, therefore, not good if a person does not receive it, or if a person does receive it? Does that change whether we were right or wrong to have shared? No. The goodness of the gospel is, speaking the gospel. It's a good work whether or not the person receives it. Someone's not better or worse than you because they, preached the gospel this one time and someone did or did not get saved. You have a responsibility to share the gospel, and the outcome is something that's determined by God. The ends do not necessarily justify the means. That we like that in America. It's very pragmatic, but the fact is the ends don't matter as much to us personally. We just have a responsibility to preach, and the ends are in God's hand. God will call out his people. God will save the ones for which he has died for. We don't know that. We've just been told, preach to everybody. And so we do. And the last thing that I just wanted to make a note of is in this section, he had an interesting little thing he dealt with because it sounded, again, so much like our modern context. And that is, he says, we are so eager when we hear about, the unbelievers in the Congo or someplace in Africa that haven't heard the gospel. We're willing to take up all kinds of money, send people overseas to do all these great things in order to get the gospel to these people that haven't heard it. But he said, the fact is the janitor down the road from you, the person working at this place and that place, they probably never heard the gospel too. There are many, in his context was England, who have never heard the gospel. In America, many people today have never heard the gospel. In fact, many people who are church-going people have never actually heard the gospel. That's scary, which is, again, why I recommend that you click on that video that I'm going to leave linked after called What is the Gospel? But with that said, that basically brings us to the end of the chapter. It was, again, a little bit kind of a shotgun and to me felt very repetitive. It's one of those things that if I was writing the book, I would have cut it. I would have condensed the best of that in the last chapter into one, especially since both these chapters seemed kind of short. But basically, it was still good stuff. It's good Charles Spurgeon stuff. If you read it totally divorced from the rest of the book, it's still good. You know what I'm saying? It's just, at this point, sounds very repetitive. I think if there's one thing, when you start reading books from way back when, brevity was never really considered an art. Nowadays, saying more in less is the skill and it's what you're aiming for. Back in those days, it really seemed to, how much can you say? And so there was no attempt to be kind of to the point. And so I would like to have seen that. But basically, that brings us to the end of this video. Thanks for watching. Of course, please remember to like, share, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. And hopefully, we'll see you next time. God bless. Have a great day. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below and feel free to like and share it so others can see it as well. Also, subscribe so that you can keep up to date on future videos. And as always, please check below to see resources that I've used that might help you further your studies. God bless and have a great day.